This audio production was made in collaboration with Audible Anarchist. This essay is an excerpt from Dirty Truths, Reflections on Politics, Media, Ideology, Conspiracy, Ethnic Life, and Class Power by Michael Parenti. Originally published in 1996. Fascism in a pinstripe suit. If fascism came to America, some say, it would be an unbearable nightmare, drastically disrupting the everyday pattern of our lives. And since our lives seem to retain their normal pattern, it follows that fascism has not taken over. In actuality, however, the fascist state, like all states, has no need to make nightmarish intrusions on the trivia of every citizen's life. The Orwellian image of Big Brother commanding an obscure citizen to do his morning exercises via two-way television leaves us with a grossly exaggerated caricature of the authoritarian state. Rather than alerting us to more realistic dangers, novels like 1984 cloud our vision with fanciful horrors of the future, thereby making the present look not at all bad in comparison, and leaving us the more convinced that there is no cause for alarm. The dirty truth is that many people find fascism to be not particularly horrible. I once asked some Iranian business people to describe what life had been like under the Shah's police state. It was perfect, they responded. Workers and servants could be cheaply procured, profits were high, and they lived very well. To be sure, fascism is not perfect for everyone. Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany inflicted a great deal of intentional hardship upon working people, including the destruction of labor unions, the loss of job benefits, and a shift in national income from the lower and middle classes to the upper class. Many among the petty bourgeoisie in Germany, who generally supported the Nazi Party, suffered the loss of their small businesses and the dread slippage into working class ranks, with jobs in the armaments factories when they were lucky enough to find employment. The number of Germans who lived in poverty and want increased substantially as wages were cut by as much as 40%. Those who equate fascism with the horrors of Auschwitz are correct in their moral condemnation, but mistaken in their sense of sequence. The worst of Auschwitz did not come until the war years. As late as 1939, the Nazi state was still pursuing a policy of encouraging, and more often forcing, the immigration of Jews to other lands. Mass liquidation as a final solution was not seriously considered and was in fact opposed until Hitler's order came, sometime after March 1941, most historians believe. The concentration camp was never the normal condition for the average Gentile German. Unless one was Jewish, or poor and unemployed, or actively leftist, or otherwise openly anti-Nazi, Germany from 1933 until well into the war was not a nightmarish place. All the good Germans had to do was obey the law, pay their taxes, give their sons to the army, avoid any sign of political heterodoxy, and look the other way when unions were busted and troublesome people disappeared. Since many middle Americans already obey the law, pay their taxes, give their sons to the army, are themselves distrustful of political heterodoxy, and applaud when unions are broken and troublesome people are disposed of, they probably could live without much personal torment in a fascist state. Some of them certainly seem eager to do so. Orwell's imaginings to the contrary, what is so terrifying about fascism is its normality, its compatibility with the collective sentiments of substantial numbers of normal persons, though probably never a majority in any society. We might do well to stop thinking of fascism as being a simple either-or condition. The political system of any one country encompasses a variety of uneven and seemingly incongruous institutional practices. To insist that fascism does not obtain until every abomination of the Nazi state is replicated and every vestige of constitutional government is obliterated is to overlook, at our peril, the disturbingly anti-democratic, authoritarian manifestations inherent in many states that call themselves democracies. Selective Repression. It is sometimes argued by those who deny the imminence of American fascism that we are more free today than ever before. One's ability to accept such reassurance partly depends on the class conditions and life chances that one confronts. The affluent individual whose views fit into that portion of the American political spectrum known as the mainstream, from rightist Republican to centrist Democrat, and whose political actions are limited to the standardized forms of participation, informal discussion, television viewing, newspaper reading, and voting, is apt to dismiss the contention that America is fascistic. But those who oppose the existing political orthodoxy and who find themselves under surveillance and subjected to the intimidations, harassments, and sanctions of the US national security state have a less sanguine view. Over the last several decades, just about every African American protest leader who achieved any local or national prominence eventually ended up either under indictment, in jail, on appeal, in hiding, in exile, or murdered by the forces of law and order. Most of the killings went unreported in the national press. Few, if any, of the law officers involved were ever convicted of murder by the predominantly white, middle American juries that passed judgment on these matters. The leniency displayed by authorities towards those on the right side of the political spectrum stands in marked contrast to the relentless, punitive justice meted out to people of color, the poor, and radicals of all stripes. While the guardians go unguarded, political activists are arrested on trumped-up charges and end up serving astronomical sentences for crimes they never committed or for relatively minor offenses. The last decade or so has seen a growth in reactionary and racist groups, yet the government does little about them. In the first half of 1995 alone, a county employee in California who refused a demand by rightist anti-tax activists to remove an IRS lien imposed on one of them was beaten by two men and slashed with a knife. A judge in Montana was terrorized, threatened with kidnapping, and had a murder contract put out on her by a militia group that claimed she had no jurisdiction over them. A federal wildlife worker received a threat that his wife and children would be bound in barbed wire and stuffed down a well. During a forum on Capitol Hill, government workers, environmentalists, and abortion rights activists described incidents of harassment, intimidation, and violence perpetrated by paramilitary groups. A number of these groups are financed by shady individuals of affluent means. In 1995, the Republican-controlled Congress refused to hold hearings on these paramilitary groups. Meanwhile, the Justice Department has done next to nothing about the menacing arms caches, threats, and openly violent actions these organizations have delivered upon others. At the same time, however, the government's repressive mechanism is geared up against leftist dissenters. The FBI and local police red squads are once again spying, burglarizing, disrupting, or otherwise targeting various organizations that work for social justice, peace and disarmament, or environmentalism. During the 1980s, almost 200 organizations were labeled, not communist fronts, as during the repressive McCarthy era of the 1950s, but terrorist fronts, including Martin Luther King Jr.'s own Southern Leadership Conference and various church and student organizations. President Clinton lifted not a finger to undo this new roundup list, and in 1995 supported a repressive counter-terrorist act that gives the president the power to arrest and detain without benefit of evidence or trial, or even formal charges, individuals deemed to be aiding any group designated as terrorist by the president. The bill passed the Senate by a large majority, but was voted down in the House. Political law. In the last 2 decades, one of the fastest growing markets has been in guns, clubs, helmets, bulletproof vests, and other items of domestic warfare sold to law enforcers, and the fastest growing area of public employment has been police and prison guards. The prison populations in most states have grown exponentially, mostly with small-time drug users. By 1995-96, California was spending more on prisons than on education. This is not to assume that the police are busy fighting crime. For all their new equipment and personnel, they do little, if anything, to stop the big drug traffickers, slumlords, sweatshop operators, mobsters, corrupt politicians, spouse beaters, child abusers, rapists, muggers, hate mongers, and others who prey off the most vulnerable among us. The real function of the police is social control. Their job is to keep in line those elements that might prove potentially troublesome to the powers that be. Take a look at the TV documentary cop shows that are in such abundant supply. What repeatedly comes across is how the police deal not with the victimizers but the victims, the down and outs and panhandlers, the homeless, the poor and unemployed, the prostitutes, illegal immigrants, alcoholics and drug addicts, victims who are represented as criminals to the viewing audience. The social control function of law enforcement operates on 3 levels within inner-city communities and among potentially troublesome populations. First, there's a street-level repression provoked and perpetuated by too many police officers who use their badges and guns as a cover for venting their racist animosities and personal distortions. All this is a matter of public record, with case after case of police brutality and case after case of settlements. And for every brutality victim who wins damages, there are many who never make it into court. Second, there is the mass trafficking in narcotics, in which the police play an active role as distributors along with federal agencies, such as the CIA, that are linked directly to overseas traffickers. This too is a matter of public record, with findings by 3 different congressional committees and sworn testimony by pilots who have flown narcotics and weapons shipments for the CIA. On the third level are the coordinated, systematic efforts by federal, state, and local authorities to undermine community protest organizations because the powers that be prefer demoralized, divided, disorganized, and drug-ridden populations to people who are politicized and who mobilize for collective action and radical change. Members of various African American and Latino groups, such as the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, Brown Berets, Black Men Against Crack, and the Crips and Bloods, after these gangs became politicized, can testify that when they were involved in crime, they had less trouble from the police than when they became politically mobilized against drugs, police brutality, and exploitative social relations within the inner city communities. In attacks conducted jointly by local authorities and federal agents, Black Panther offices across the country were raided and destroyed, their funds stolen, and their occupants arrested or shot. At least 34 Panthers perished in the repression of the 1970s. Hundreds of others were incarcerated, many on trumped-up charges. Some, like Geronimo Pratt, are still in prison over 20 years later. These 3 levels of political repression operate symbiotically with each other. The racist cops and the drug traffickers get an implicit green light from higher up, and the officials are served in their larger agenda by the racist cops and the drug pushers. In addition, the police themselves are often politicized, identifying with a right-wing application of the law, taking their encouragement from the pronouncements of elected officials who pander to popular fears about crime. Familiarity and the moderate center. It seems that the ability of most middle-class whites to perceive the fascist features of American society is seriously blunted not only by their class experiences, but by the aura of familiarity and legitimacy that enshrouds the established political culture. In making comparisons between their society and others, they tend to employ a double standard. Thus, the organized forms of police violence in America are seen as isolated, aberrant happenings, on the infrequent occasion they are publicized, rather than as inherent manifestations of our social order. But the same practices in certain other lands are treated as predictable components of totalitarian systems. The Nazi invasion of Poland is fascism in action. The American invasion of Vietnam is a blunder, or at worst, an immoral application of power. The indoctrination of children in Nazi Germany into the myths and rituals of the nation-state is seen as characteristic of fascism, but our own grade school indoctrination replete with flag salutes, national anthems, and history books espousing the myths of American superiority is education for citizenship. Many social arrangements and happenings that would evoke strongly negative sentiments, if defined as products of a totalitarian state, become, by their proximity and cultural familiarity, no cause for alarm when practiced at home. The political mainstream is frequently characterized by those who occupy it as a democratic force fighting a war on 2 fronts against the extremes of right and left. However, a closer reading of history tells us that the center has been more inclined to make common cause with the right against the left, rather than oppose both with equal fervor. Far from being a blameless victim when fascism emerges triumphant, the center is an accomplice. In Germany, as early as 1918, the Social Democratic leader Ebert entered an alliance with Field Marshal von Hindenburg, quote, in order to fight Bolshevism, unquote. Throughout the Weimar Republic, as Franz Neumann records in his book Behemoth, quote, every law aimed supposedly against both communists and National Socialists, Nazis, was invariably enforced against the Socialist Party and the entire left, but rarely against the right, unquote. Those leftists who were critical of the illegal rearmament of Germany found themselves charged and tried for treason, while rightist assassins and putschists, quote, were either not prosecuted at all or were dealt with lightly, unquote. The collusion between center and right is understandable, despite their differences in emphasis and methods, differences that are not always to be dismissed as insignificant. the center and right share a common commitment to the ongoing corporate class structure and conservative institutional authority. While capable of extensive repressive actions at home and abroad, centrists continue to think of themselves as incapable of the extremism ascribed to the right and left. Indeed, the very linear model they apply to politics, extreme left, left, center, right, extreme right, like any line or spectrum, can extend itself at both ends to allow for limitless extremes but makes no spatial provision for an extreme center. The extreme, according to Webster's, is, quote, the utmost part, the utmost limit, and extremity, unquote. Therefore, the very notion of an extreme center is a contradiction in terms. The extremes of the center on a linear political spectrum, to the extent they can be imagined, are nothing more than the beginnings of a moderate left and moderate right. But extreme has another meaning, to quote Webster's, quote, an excessive or immoderate degree, condition, or measure, unquote. Implicit in the second definition is the image of the intransigent, dogmatic, and violent extremist, and in common political parlance, this second meaning is often conflated with the first, so that the linear relationship, the spectrum, takes on a moral quality of its own. By virtue of a pun, then, the center becomes incapable of political extremism. Yet, in truth, it does not follow that those who occupy the extremes of a linear model, a placement made in accordance with beliefs about changing the established social order, must perforce be extremists in the pejorative sense. Those of us designated as extreme leftists actually want rather moderate and civil things: a clean environment, a fair tax structure, use of social production for social needs, expansion of public sector production, serious cuts in a bloated military budget, affordable housing, decently paying jobs, equal justice for all, and the like. There's nothing morally extreme about such things. They are extreme only in the sense of being extremely at odds with the dominant interests of the status quo. In the face of such gross injustice and class privilege, considerations of social justice and betterment take on the appearance of extreme measures. Nor does it follow that those who occupy the center of any political spectrum are thereby incapable of the kind of brutal, repressive, destructive, intransigent actions usually associated with fascist extremists. It was not the John Birch Society that tried to bomb Indochina into the Stone Age, nor was it the American Nazi Party that perfected napalm and put thalidomide in the defoliants used throughout Indochina. And today, it is not the skinheads and Klan that maintain the death squads and other homicidal operations throughout so much of the Third World. It is the best and the brightest of the political center, with plenty of help from rightists. Searching for scapegoats. The way the mainstream shades off into the fascist right can be seen quite clearly in the Republican Party. The GOP socio-economic agenda is not much different from the kind pushed by Mussolini and Hitler: break the labor unions, depress wages, impose a rightist ideological monopoly over the media, abolish taxes for the big corporations and the rich, eliminate government regulations designed for worker and consumer safety and environmental protection, plunder public lands, privatize public enterprises, wipe out most human services, and liberal bait and race bait all those opposed to such measures. Regarding that last point, one of the main tactics of fascism is to direct the legitimate grievances of the populace toward irrelevant foes: Jews, communists, gypsies, labor unions. So today, in the United States, we witness middle Americans beset by real economic difficulties and social frustrations as taxpayers, wage earners, and citizens, but too well indoctrinated and too committed to the conventional social order to make any realistic indictment of the multinational corporate system. They are told that the military and the big corporations are the mainstays of Americanism, and they are invited to turn their anger toward irrelevant and often imaginary foes, such as African Americans, Latinos, Jews, the poor, welfare chiselers, immigrants, feminists, gays, advocates of legal abortions, atheists, the supposedly liberal media, and other cultural elites, whoever they are, the hidden United Nations army that is secretly occupying the USA, and the various real and imagined violators of law and order. While US rulers and the corporate-owned major media regularly ignore the legitimate and pressing grievances of socially deprived groups, there seems no limit to the sympathetic attention they give to angry Klan members, troubled Nazis, and anguished militiamen, almost all of whom are rightist, racist, and armed to the teeth, and rarely, if ever, do they invite the public to consider whether it actually is the welfare mothers or illegal immigrants who bring us record deficits, war, swollen military budgets, high taxes, poverty, urban blight, inflation, crime, unemployment, and environmental devastation. As when fascism first emerged in Italy and Germany, the center shows a tender tolerance for the ultra-right while seeking to exercise an intimidating and repressive control over the left. Not surprisingly, many of the same people who support these autocratic, statist measures against democratic dissenters are the first to deny that fascism is a threat to the United States. But growing numbers of us have lost our skepticism. What we fear is not the cataclysm, but the drift. In fact, it is less a drift toward fascism than a concerted push by the purveyors of state power. Not only do the higher circles attack the standard of living of the populace, they attack the democratic rights that enable us to launch any kind of counterattack to defend ourselves from being plunged into third worlddom. In the final analysis, the danger of fascism comes not from the handful of skinheads or militia, but from the various enforcement agencies of the national security state, those who would divest us of whatever remains of our livelihoods and democratic rights under the guise of doing what is best for America. This has been a production of Audible Anarchist. You can find more Audible Anarchist on YouTube.